Hi, I'm Tony, and today we're starting the Halloween Pixelated Quilt Along. This is a quilt along that is a few years in the making, and it is finally launched. So today we are going to be working on block number 1, the bat. Very excited for it. These videos were filmed live on YouTube as a class, and I have edited it and condensed it down so you only get the instructional parts of it and not all like the chatter with the live chat that we normally get in classes. So it's easy for you to follow along so that you can make the bat block yourself. Let's get started. Like I said earlier to the live stream, all of the directions are giving you how to make a standalone block or how to do it as part of the quilt along. You'll notice that there are certain parts in block number 1 where it will say set aside the things. So if this block's being made as part of the Pixelated Halloween Quilt Along, set aside any fabric and combined strips you didn't use for future blocks. Of course, if you're just making this block as a standalone block, you don't do that. This is the only one where you're not really worried about pulling things from previous blocks. Future blocks, you'll have to do that. So we will be reusing some of our combined strips. We will be reusing some of our solids for future blocks. So keep that in mind. Let's start to sew. Let's start to get our things together. All right, now, if you've used any of my patterns before, if you've done any of my pixelated patterns, then you may have picked up my pixelated template sets. This is a really cool set that actually helps you cut perfect pieces for all of my pixel patterns. I like that alliteration. Perfect pieces for pixel patterns. Now, unfortunately, with this one, it's a little bit of a different size. So we can't use those pixel templates for this quilt along. I'm currently working with Martelli. In fact, we were supposed to launch it this month, but we haven't quite gotten around to it yet. There are templates coming. So if you like my pixel templates and you want a new set for the 2.5 and 4.5, the 2.5 by 2.5, and the 2.5 by 1.5, then keep your eyes open. They are coming. I'm very excited about that. All right, so for right now, that just means we're going to have to do our standard cutting. Now, whenever you cut, I always recommend with my pixel patterns to use a rotary cutter and straight edge. I'm going to be showing you how to cut the strips out a couple of different ways, including a standard straight edge, and then my favorite, the stripology ruler. The stripology ruler is a way that you can cut your strips a lot faster, and it works for almost any strip project, but most importantly, the pixel patterns. All right, so let's take a look. Now, what we want to do, now all of this stuff in the purple up here, this is instructions that if you're brand new, so let's say if this is your very first quilt, or maybe your second quilt, make sure you read all of the instructions in purple because it's going to break everything down. I assume that you know how to use a sewing machine, and that is it. I do not assume that you have quilted before. I do not assume that you have pixel quilted before. I assume you can sew a straight-ish line. And we take everything from there. Now, if you are an experienced quilter that can sew straight lines and you can go quickly and you've stripped pieced before, you can skip a lot of the purple stuff, which is why we highlight it. So you know that you can just gloss over those areas. Now, if you are making it as part of a quilt, as this quilt along, well then just grab your fabrics. These are the ones that I'm using. So these are my brown, my dark gray, my black, and my yellow fabrics that I've got. And we want to cut these strips. So we're taking a look at our chart here, and this chart is the same for every single one of my patterns. You'll always have to cut 2 different size strips. The 2.5 strips are for all of your solid pieces. The 1.5 strips are for your combined pieces. So let's get cutting. All right, so look at my black. Now with the black, of course, if you have not cut strips before with rotary cutters, Remember, for the 2.5 inch strips, what you want to do is first square this up. Make sure that this is square, and it is not. So I'm actually going to square it up using my Stripology because I like the square up much, much better for here. Because the square up is literally cutting it along the 0. And that's nice and squared up. Now, you always want to square your fabric up. Squaring this up is important because when you square it up, you're making sure that you have a nice straight edge right here that you can sew against. So whenever we're using our regular straight edge, we want to cut 2 2.5 inch strips. So what we want to do is line this up so our top line here is also even with our 2.5 inch strip right there. And then I find after you cut it, move the right fabric away. And if you have anything that's pulling, at that point you can trim it again. If you try to pull it away right here, well then it may get a little wonky, especially if you haven't done a nice clean cut. And then you can line this up again and do it again. And then once you do those 2.5s, let's cut our 1.5s. So we want 3 of those. 1 and 2. Now you see how slow I am cutting these strips. Now let's take a look at the next color, which is brown. Now we're just going to take all of these, and I like to make 2 different piles up here. One of the 2.5 inch strips and one pile of the 1.5 inch strips. Okay, so now let's use my Stripology ruler. Now the Stripology is a little expensive. I believe right now it's running about $60. However, if you do a lot of stripping, including pixel quilting, I find it is a really, really, really good investment. So brown, we went 3 and 2. So 1, 2, 3, and then 2. 1, 2, and just like that, it's done. So if you have one, make sure you're using it. If you don't, it's fine. I will slow down a bit to make sure that you can catch up. All right, so at this point, I'm going to go ahead and cut the remaining fabric. I'll speed up the video a little bit, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about cutting those solid pieces. Alright, so we have our 2.5 and our 1.5 inch strips cut. The instructions say we're going to take all of the 1.5s, we're going to set them aside, because remember, we're going to sew those 1.5 inch strips together and then cut pieces from those. So let's take a look at the 2.5 inch pieces. So we've got, let's start with the black. So what I like to do whenever I'm cutting my solid pieces is I like to keep my fabrics folded together. And what that does is it actually allows me to be efficient in my cutting and cut 2 pieces at once. But wait, there's more. I'm going to iron, you know, let me just iron all of my fabrics. So whenever you cut multiple strips, you can cut even more. So for example, there are 2 black strips here. So what I'm going to do whenever I do my rotary cutting for my solid pieces, I'm going to cut both of those black strips at the same exact time. So you know what? Let me show you that. And then when I'm speeding up the video, I can show you the rest of them. So for example, I've got both of my black strips right here. So each one is folded in half. So as I'm counting 2 at a time. Then I have another one I can set on top. So I'm now counting 4 at a time. Now, the trick to doing this, of being efficient with your cutting and cutting multiple pieces, is making sure it's lined up. So you notice how I'm using this line on my cutting mat to line everything up. And then I'm going to lay my Stripology ruler down right over top of it. Now, if you haven't used a Stripology ruler for this before, you want to take your line and line it up along the top right there. And it allows you to quickly just cut out those solid pieces. Now, if you're using a standard straight edge, if you don't have a Stripology, then what you want to do is cut off at the end, square it up, and then go down the line. And as you're cutting them, make sure you're moving the strip to the right, not pulling the strips to the left, but make sure that you keep everything perfectly lined up. Now, this strategy also works whenever you have more than 2 strips. So if you have multiple strips, you can then start layering them down. I have personally cut through 8 strips that have been folded in half at the same time. So it is definitely possible, and it speeds up your cutting, and it makes it a lot more efficient. So let's take a look at the black. Now with my blacks, the instructions say to cut 2.5 by 4.5 rectangles. Well, this is 2.5 inches wide. So we're going to cut 4.5-inch rectangles. So let's square that up, and then a 4.5. Now remember, I'm cutting 4 pieces at a time. Or according to the directions, I only need 4 pieces. Well, great, so I'm done. Now I need 10 2.5s. So 1, 2.5, there's 4. 1, 2.5, there's 8. Now at this point, I can take one of these strips away and cut 2 pieces, or go, it's the first block. Chances are I'm going to use at least 2 more 2.5-inch pieces. So 1, 2, and 2. And then what I'll do then is take the 2 away from here and set it aside. And this is going to get set aside for future blocks. So I'm going to set that off to the side. And then here are all of my solid pieces. Now, whenever I was first pixel quilting, I used to actually take all of my pieces and I used to sit and do this and make sure they were all facing up. You know what? That's actually a waste of time. Because chances are, when you're laying your pieces out, if you take this piece, I know that's not the right side. That's the wrong side. I'm not going to lay that down. So you would only need to do that if you have pieces where it's important that you know what the right side is. For example, Michael Miller has a fairy frost fabric that glows in the dark. It is a white fabric that glows in the dark, and the glow is only on a single side. And if you're just looking at it without staring at it, it's easy to mix up which is the right and the wrong side. Well, in that case, you'd have to pick it up and put it down and make sure you do that. Ooh, if someone uses that for this quilt, that'd be actually kind of cool. Sorry, I just thought of all that because it's a Halloween quilt and it glows in the dark. That'd be kind of spooky and cool. All right, so that is your solid pieces. So I'm going to speed up the video, cut the orange. I know my colors. I really do. I'm going to cut my brown and my dark gray from my 2.5-inch strips. I'm going to iron them and cut them. And then I'll come back from the sped up video and I will show you how to combine those 1.5-inch strips. And we have our solid pieces. So the solid pieces are done. So now we need to take a look at the combined pieces. Now, according to page number 2, what we need to do is do a black strip. Now, this is how I like to lay it out before I go to my sewing machine. A black strip to a brown strip. A black strip to a dark gray strip. A black strip to a light yellow strip, a brown to a dark gray. And as you're sewing, you could just grab the first two, sew those, grab the next two, sew those, grab the next two, sew those, grab the next two, sew those. You do not need to iron these because we are going to be ironing them before we cut them. You do not have to iron your strips before you sew them together. That is stripping 101 principle of saving time. Don't have to worry about ironing that stuff. So let me go to the sewing machine and show you how we do our stripping. Stripping 101. I have a video all about stripping, so if I go a little fast or if you want to repeat or slow down or re-look at it, take a look at my video on stripping. If you're watching this video as the condensed tutorial on YouTube, I've got the link down below, but you can always just go to my channel and search stripping and it'll pop right up. What you want to do first is take your two strips you've got, shake them out. Trust me, shake them out. You do not want to know how many times I have sewed strips together and one of the strips has been caught up behind the other strip and I've sewn it like that and then had to take out my seam ripper and take it all out. So shake your strips out. Trust me. Then I always like to take the shortest one and put the shortest one on top. Just because as you're sewing it, it's going to stretch that top fabric just a little bit. So you're actually going to get more fabric and out of it by just putting that shorter one right on top. Then start at a few stitches. Now I use a 1/4 inch foot with guide. So as long as I am touching this 1/4 inch foot, I'm sewing a perfect straight line. Because I can't sew a straight line. I need help sewing a straight line. In fact, I've got a video on how to sew a straight line using all sorts of these gadgets and gizmos that you can figure that stuff out. I am personally going to be sewing a scant 1/4 inch with my things. If you've quilted before, you know what a scant 1/4 inch is. I suggest using that. If you don't know what a scant 1/4 inch is, don't worry about it. If you want to know about it, I've got a tutorial video all about the scant 1/4 inch. And how, why you want to use it, what's the history of it, everything else. But don't worry about it if you don't want to take the time to look at it. You can use a regular 1/4 inch. But for my scant, I'm actually not going to touch this. I'm going to move just to the left of it in order to do that. So, alright, so now whenever I'm doing this, how I strip is I take my finger and I put it in here. I take my thumb, I put it up here, and the rest of my fingers are all dangly down here. And then I'm just going to sew. Now you notice my top fabric, I can go back and forth. For those of you that are new to sewing, you see my hand right here? This hand is not touching anything. This hand is just sitting here just like this. Do not push your fabric into your machine. Do not pull your fabric from your machine. You let the feed dogs, which are these things under here, grab your fabric and take your fabric away. All right, so just like that. So this is what we're going to be doing, is we're going to be strip piecing all 4 of these combinations. So I'm going to speed the video up for the stripping, and we'll go back and I'll show you how we're going to cut these pieces out. Alright, so we have our strips sewn together. So now the next thing I want you to do is cut each of the strips, the combined strips, in half. So what you want to do is first you want to separate our strips, and then you want to fold your strip over to cut it in half. Now the best way to do this to make sure that you've got the most amount of fabric to use is take a look at those selvages. So you see how this selvage is up to right there, and then this one's right there. So let's line those selvages up. So those are there. So you see how I'm not lining up the ends? I'm lining up those selvages. And then bringing it down and cutting it in half. And then whenever I lay it down, I like to take it and have my cut piece on the left-hand side. It's just easier for me to keep track of. It's just a lot nicer. So let's line this up. We want to take that selvage. It'd be the yellow to the brown, to the black in this case. Now, because you want to make sure to get as much fabric as you can get out of it as possible. So by cutting it that way, you've got it. All right, so let's do this. And salvage to salvage. And trim. And then the last but not least is this one. And now, after we trim these, we're going to iron them. Now, when we're ironing them, we want to make sure that we're ironing our strips in opposite directions. Okay, so what does that mean? So let me show you before I bring up my ironing board. So let's take a look at the combined black and orange. Black and orange. I know my colors. I really do. I think I'm still a little tired. All right, so black and brown. So we've got our black and brown piece. Now, this wants us to cut 4 sets of the 2.5 by 2.5 and 4 sets of the 2.5 by 1.5. Okay? So what we want to do is we're going to iron these like this. So I'm laying them out like this, and then I'm ironing this first one up towards the black. Then I'm ironing the second one up towards the brown. Do not iron your seams open. It is extremely important that you iron seams to one side because we are going to use a technique called nesting the seams. And that is how you get those perfect points in pixel quilting. So that's what we're doing for every single one. So we're ironing it to the one direction and then to the other direction. So let me do my first one. So let's take, here is my brown and my black. The first thing you want to do is make sure that you iron that top strip. You want to lock that seam into place. By locking that seam in, you're making sure that it's not going to move a lot when you're doing this. So it's not going to stretch and change that fabric too much whenever you lock that in. There you are. So there's our first one. And now let's do the other half. So this is the other half of the black and brown, where I'm going to go towards the black because I've already ironed it towards the brown. Just like that. Perfect. All right, so let me set this aside. Now, it doesn't make a difference which one you have on the bottom. You can have either one on the bottom. Just pick one that you want to have on the bottom. Okay, so I'm going to have this one right here on my bottom. So then I'm going to take my other piece and I'm going to flip it up over top of this piece right here. So that you have either both browns on top or both blacks on top. So you notice how it's the exact same thing but reversed. And if we take a look at those seams, you see how those seams are pointing in opposite directions. So this one's pointing towards the brown, this one's pointing towards the black. So that's important. So we're going to now what's called nest the seams. I'm going to take my fingers and I'm going to move it around until I can feel that those seams are lined up against each other all the way down. So make sure you've got that. Now, if you line that up correctly, it should look like this. So you see how those are right up against each other? That's what you're trying to do the whole way down. And then we cut. So if you're using a straight edge, you want to trim off the end first and then move your way down. Now we are cutting in sets. Remember, I said we're cutting in sets. So let me use my stripology ruler. We want to cut these like this. Now, if you're using a stripology ruler, ignore the top and the bottom. you want to line it up by your seam. Make sure your seam is the straight line, and that's where you want to line that up. So we're cutting 4 sets of 2.5. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4. So I cut 4 sets, so that means I now have 8 pieces. And then I'm cutting 4 sets of the 1.5. 1, 2, 3, 4. And remember what I said, you want to take all the extras, set them aside so we can have those ready for future blocks. Then you want to open these up. So take them, and I like to put them in 2 separate piles, because this pile, our seam is pointing towards the black, and then this pile, our seam is pointing towards the brown. And it's important to make sure that you know which way those seams point whenever we do our next step and laying out our pieces. All right, so let's do this. And then there's all of our pieces. So I'm going to set that aside up with our solid pieces. So I'm going to go ahead and finish cutting out I'm going to iron and cut out the rest of these pieces. I'll speed up the video, and then we'll come back and start talking about laying the pieces out. Now, at this point, we've got everything laid out. So now we want to look at this. We want to look at our laid out pieces. So how we do this is I want to take all of my pieces and I want to set them out so that I can easily grab each of those pieces. There we are. Just like that. And let's put this up here. You can't see it because of the overlay, but it's there. So I'm going to take these pieces and I'm going to lay them out here. Laying pieces out. So I touched a little bit on about this last week for laying your pieces out. I'm going to go over it again though, because we're going to do it line by line. I'm going to do row by row, and I'm going to show you how we're going to be pinning these. So if we take a look at row number 1, I've got my 2 pieces. Now remember, when you're laying your pieces out, make sure you're looking at the pattern and what they refer to for the actual pieces. So for example, this piece right here, whenever we are cutting it, that's what it looks like. So of course, it's the same exact picture on the pattern itself. So keep an eye out on that and look to see, try to keep an eye on which pieces you're supposed to do ahead of time. So we've got these 2 already, and then we're going to need this one. Now this third piece, it is a combined piece. In this case, it does not make a difference which way your seam points, because it's not going to be sewn to another piece. And I'll show you what I mean in future rows. So we've got that one right there, and then let's lay out 2 more. So we've got all of our pieces laid out for row 1. Now, if you take a look at row 1, it looks like the arrow is pointed to the right. So arrow's pointed that way, to the right. I like to do an easy trick of sewing and ironing all in one go before checking to see which way the seam has to go. So an easy way that I've learned is if the arrow's going to the right, you want to pick up the right piece and put it over that left piece and then pin it into place. Because then what's going to happen after you sew this and then you take it to the ironing board and you iron it, it's automatically going to get ironed this way, and that's the way that the seam needs to go. Okay, so if this seam is pointing to the right, right over left, and pin that into place. Now, if you notice for row number 1, we only have 5 pieces. It's an odd number. So we have a lone little piece right here that cannot be matched up with another piece. That's perfectly okay. It is okay to have those lone little pieces all by themselves, because we're going to include them the next time through. Okay, so That is row number 1. So row number 2, let me start to lay out those pieces. I've got that one, and that one. I combined one of those. So same thing with the first row. This one is not being sewn on either side to another combined piece, so we don't have to worry about which way that seam points. The next one is this one right here. And then, now, this next one is a black and a gray combined piece. It does matter which way the seam goes, because our seams point to the right. Okay, so our seams point to the right, so we need to get the piece that is pointing towards the gray. So from black to gray. So, because it needs to go that way. So our seams are going that way because the seam, wait, no, I'm wrong. I'm absolutely wrong. I was looking at the wrong one. Row number 2 has to go towards the black because the seam's pointing to the left. I was still thinking of row number 1 to the right. Row 2 is to the left, that way. All right, and then we've got a combined brown and black small piece, and one of those, and one of those. Now, this, like I said, the row number 2 is going to the left. So we're going to take our left piece, flip it over the right piece, and pin that into place. Because if I sew this and then iron it, it's going to go that way, which is where we want it to go, to the left. Alright, so let's do the rest of row number 2. And then row number 3, I'm going to show you how to line it up if you have combined pieces next to each other. Alright, and it looks like row number 2 has an even number of pieces, so we don't have any pieces left out. There we go. Perfect. Alright, and then row number 3. We start to lay these pieces out. So we've got one of those. I've got one of these. This way. I've got one of these. Now, here's the trick. We've got 2 of these next to each other. So one going this way and one going this way. The seams need to go in opposite directions. So in the case of what I did is I got them both going towards the black. So in this case, it's going to the black and it's going towards the black. So that way, whenever I pin them together, they're going to be able to line up and nest for perfect points every single time. Okay, so whenever you're laying these out, make sure that those seams are going in opposite directions. That's why we're sewing these rows with the seams going in opposite directions, because remember, we talked about this earlier, you want to nest those seams so you get those perfect points. So we've got that one, and then there. And then of course row number 3, our arrow is pointing to the right, so we are going to pick up the right over left, and pin that into place. So at this point, I'm going to speed up the video. Now that I've shown you how to lay all these out, I'm going to finish laying all of my pieces out. I'm going to pin them all, and then I'll come back and I'll show you how we're going to sew them. So, I'm going to be chain piecing. I have a video all about chain piecing. It is, if you're watching this as a recorded video, the link is down below. If you're watching me live, You can just search chain piecing on my YouTube channel and it'll pop right up. I'm going to give you a basic overview of chain piecing, but the video will give you a more in-depth. Basically, chain piecing, you want to have a scrap of fabric. So we've got a scrap of fabric in there that's going to start as our base. Then we take our pieces and we put them in. Now remember, kids, do as I say, not as I do. Please do not sew over your pins. It is a horrible, horrible bad habit that I have and not a very good one. Now, we're going to remove our scrap fabric for right now and we're going to enter it in again whenever we finish. So we're just going to go through and sew our pieces. And then I'm grabbing the next row. So this is row number 9. Now I'm grabbing row number 8. And I'm putting row number 8 in. Now after I start sewing row number 8, I'm going to trim row number 9 away. And at this point, I'm going to separate all of my pieces. And then I'm going to lay it back out again. So that I'm going to take row number 9. Now remember, I'm still keeping them facing the same direction because that's important. Because whenever we pin these, this is the way that I want to iron it to make sure that my seams are pointing in the same direction. So that is now row number 9. And that's all you're doing. Now there's ways that you can speed up your chain piecing a little bit. I know there's a couple of handy dandy chain piece separators, like the Gypsy Quilter makes some, Clover makes one. There's a couple of companies that make them. Just take a look at the chain piece separators, or again, I've got this linked on most of my videos, especially on the chain piecing video. I link the Gypsy Quilter one. So go ahead and sew your rows then. Don't forget, keeping them the same, facing the same direction. Do not flip your pieces over. And then whenever you're putting your next one in, cut away the previous one. Separate your pieces and put them back down. So in the case of the chain piecing, you just do just like that to separate them. It's super easy. So at this point, I'm going to speed the video up. I'm going to finish sewing all of my rows, and then we'll come back and I'll show you how we're going to iron them. Ironing. Now, remember, when we iron, it should stay just like this. Oops, let me go up here. That way you can actually see. There we go. It should stay. So here's row number 1. It should stay flat just like that. So when I lay these down for row number 1 and iron it, it should be already fine. So whenever you iron, make sure you iron your seams, because that's going to lock those seams into place and help whenever you're ironing it to one side. Because you do not want to stretch and warp your fabric, it would affect your project. So by locking those seams in, you're making sure that those are nice and straight. So I'm just going to take these and I'm going to lay it on that first row. And I'm going to take that second row. I'm going to lay these out. And same thing, we're locking these seams into place. And then ironing it to the one side. So I'm going to speed up the camera. We're going to do some ironing, and then I'll come back and I'll show you how we're going to lay this out and start our second pass for pinning it. Our pieces are ironed. So now let's lay them out for our second pass. So every time I actually go through and sew the pieces together, I call that a pass. All right, so let's take a look at row number 1. So row number 1, what we want to do is needs to go to the right. So remember, we're looking to see where the arrow is pointing. Row number 1 is going to the right-hand side. So these 3, just like that, are row number 1. There are only 3 pieces left, and that's it. So I'm going to be efficient and pin both sides, all 3 pieces together at the same time. So I'm going to pin both the left and the right. So remember, if you have any seams, pin those seams to make sure that those seams don't flip back and get caught and add extra bulk to your project. Alright, so here's row number 1 is ready to go. Alright, and then row number 2. So row 2, our seams need to go to the left. So I'm going to lay pieces out just like this. And they should be in the reverse order. There we are, and then there and there. So there we have 4 pieces, and we have an even number of pieces. So remember, row 2 is to the left, so I'm going to take left over right and pin that into place. Just like this. There we are, and I'm going to keep on going until we have an odd number to show you what we're going to do with odd numbers. Now, row number 3, our seams are pointing to the right. So I'm going to pick this up. I'm going to make sure my seams go to the right. So you see how that seam right there is moving to the right. So that's what I want to do. And then this one, oh, this one, I did it this way. It goes there, there. Uh-oh. Nope, what did I do? Uh-oh. I ironed that one wrong. I ironed 2 of them wrong. Hey, look, at least I laid them out, but somehow I must have flipped something, either when I was pinning or when I was ironing. It's perfectly okay. If that happens, you can just re-iron those. So let's make sure that this all is good. There, there, there. Yep, I have not sewn anything incorrectly. So what I need to do is it needs to go to the right. So I need to re-iron these 2 pieces. There we are. That now goes to the right. And let's re-iron this one. Because remember, it doesn't matter how long you have sewn. It does not matter if you think you know all the things about sewing and quilting. You're gonna still make mistakes. It is perfectly okay. Alright, so row number 3, going to the right, so taking right over left, and pinning that into place. There we go. Right over left, and pin that into place. Do you know how many times I pick up pieces wrong, or I iron them wrong, or I flip things? Yeah, no, if I mess up, I would rather have it be because I've ironed it wrong. Alright, row number 4. This goes to the left. Okay, so I've got that one. And what I'm doing is I'm checking against my pattern as I'm laying the pieces out to make sure that it all matches. Oh, here we go, we finally have one. So with row number 4, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces. I've got 5 pieces now in row number 1. Now, remember in row number 1, 4. This is row 4. 4. 4. In row number 4, I've got this little odd piece that was left all alone. All alone. Well, we want to include this little piece now. It's okay to be alone, but it's also okay to be included. So you want to include it this time. So I'm going to skip this one right here, and I'm not going to pin this one. I'm going to pin the rest of them. So row number 4 goes to the left. So I'm taking left over right. And I'm pinning this into place. Oops. That was a little off. Let's fix this. There we are. Now you're good. There we are. left over right. There we go. And that's how you do all the pinning for the second pass. So I'm going to keep on pinning. I'm going to finish pinning the rest of these rows. I'm then going to go to the sewing machine, sew them, which you've already seen how to chain piece and separate them. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to iron them, which you've already seen. And then I'm going to stop fast forwarding the video whenever I show you the last pass before we can start actually sewing our finished rows. Well, not the last pass. Next to last pass, because the last pass is sewing those rows. Alright, so next to last pass. So I was wrong. I think this is going to be our last pass. Alright, so let's take a look at it. Same thing. So now row number 1, I did not do anything with this. I did not sew this yet because this one's ready to go. It's a finished row, ready to do the final sewing. So I left that one alone. So all we're going to do for the rest of these rows is the same exact thing. So this is going to the left, so left over right, pinning it into place. So I'm just going right down, and I'm going to finish pinning all of these rows. Now, after I finish pinning all these rows, and I go to sew them, see this is row number 3, it's to the right, it's just like that. When I go to pin them, I'm going to group them up. So I'm going to actually take 2 rows at the same time to sew them, because it's going to be more efficient and easier that way when I go to iron it, because I'll do a bunch at the same time. I take that back. Normally, I will do 2 at the same time, but in this case, I probably won't, now that I think about that. I'm just going to do it like I normally do. However, oops, there's a 3. Some of these are 3s, meaning I have pinned both sides of it. So don't forget to sew both sides. And remember which row it belongs to. There we are. And then when you're ironing, oops, I almost forgot the other side. And then when you're ironing them, don't forget to iron the same way. Make sure your seams are going in that same direction as you're ironing those rows. Don't slack on making sure those seams are all going in that direction for the arrows. So at this point, I'm going to speed the video up. I'm going to finish laying all of these out. This is row number 5. I'm going to finish laying these out and pinning them. And then I'm going to sew them, and then iron them, and have my rows laid out, and then I'll come back and I'll show you how we're going to sew our rows together, which is very exciting. I love sewing rows together. We've got our rows. Let's sew our rows together. So this is how we're going to do it. I'm actually going to skip to rows 3 and 4 so I can easily show you here. What you want to do is take that bottom row and you want to flip it up over that top row, and then we're going to pin these into place. Now remember, I said you want to make sure that you nest these seams. So what you want to do is make sure that these seams are lined up so that they're going in opposite directions. There we go. So you want to do these in opposite directions. And if you do that and you perfectly line this up here, it's going to have a perfect point every single time. Now, there is a strategy to how you pin these together. What I always do is I find the very first seam that matches up, and I put a pin in that. And then I find the next one. So the next one is all the way down here. Now you notice that there's some seams on the top and the bottom between these 2 pins. That's okay. Ignore those for now, because all I'm doing for the first pass through with these pins is pinning those areas where it's lining up, and I need to make sure that I've nested those seams. Now that I've got all those pins, I'm going to go back and I'm going to finish pinning the rest of them. Now, if there is a section where you need to ease the seams, so for example, if between this area and this area, if either my top fabric or my lower fabric wasn't quite lining up into it, you would pull it, put a pin in the center, pull, center, center. The more pins you do, the better it's going to be if it's a little funky. If the top or the bottom doesn't quite line up. So you're putting pins in all of the actual seams. Then you're going to sew them, and that's it. So once you combine these rows, you're then going to sew all the rows. When you iron them, it does not make a difference which way your seam points as you're ironing. You can just iron it. You can iron your seams open or to the side. It's not going to make a difference in the bulk onto the back of your quilt because you've already ironed other seams in one direction. So then after you combine all those together, you just keep on going. You just keep combining your rows, and then you'll have your finished block. So I'm going to speed up the video, I'm going to sew, I'm going to pin the rest of these rows, I'm going to sew them, iron them, and I'm just going to keep on going. And I'm going to speed up the video whenever I show you the final block. I give you block number 1, the bat. And this is what he looks like with the Northcott Toscana fabrics. Once you finish your block, at this point, you can either go ahead and square this block up. If you square it up, 18 and a half? 18. Yeah, so you're squaring your block. It's going to be a 17 and a half finished block. So at this point you can square it up to 18 by 18, or you can wait and just square all your blocks up when you're ready to assemble. I'm always of the opinion to wait to square it up, just because if I have a block that's a little bit larger than the others or a little bit smaller than the others, I like to try to get them all the same size as the smallest block. But it's completely up to you. If you can square it now or you can square it later. And that is our bat. I love these colors from Toscana from Northcott. They are just amazing and they help pop everything. I can't wait to see what you make with your blocks. Please share them with me. Send me your blocks. Show me the fabrics that you used for the bat. And hopefully you learned something how to make a bat block. Thank you so much for joining me. I really, really appreciate it. Don't forget to like this video, follow my Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, of course YouTube, follow my YouTube, my Quite Nerdy Quilters Facebook group. I do TikTok sometimes. I have a Pinterest, I don't really do anything with it. And don't forget about Twitch, where I stream live as well as streaming live on YouTube. Schedule is always on my social media on Mondays.